October 17, 1857, Edgefield County, South Carolina. The first written mention appears in a church ledger, not a police record. A single line entered in fading brown ink beside the date. The boy again found speaking in the pasture. Livestock unsettled. No name. No accusation. Just a quiet notation that something was not right. In the late summer of 1857, Edgefield was a rural district of fields, timber, and red clay roads. Plantation farms stretched wide under heavy heat, and enslaved families worked the land from dawn to dusk. Among them was a boy known simply as Isaiah, estimated to be 12 years old, born into bondage, thin, watchful, and unusually silent. Those who remembered him years later described a child who avoided the other boys. He did not wrestle or shout or run races between the fence lines. He preferred the edges of the property, the wooded margins, the shallow creek beds, the livestock pens after dark. He carried himself with a composure that unsettled adults. He rarely cried, rarely laughed, and when spoken to directly, he answered carefully, as though measuring each word. The first report came from a field hand named Thomas Reed. Reed claimed that one evening while returning from the lower pasture, he saw Isaiah standing in the middle of the grazing field surrounded by cattle. The animals were not feeding. They stood in a circle around him, heads lowered, motionless. Reed later testified that Isaiah was speaking, not loudly, not in English. Reed could not understand the sounds. He described them as low and patterned, like he was answering someone. When Reed called out, the cattle lifted their heads simultaneously. The circle broke. The animals dispersed. Isaiah turned and walked back toward the slave quarters without running. At first it was dismissed as imagination. Livestock often gather in strange formations. A child talking to himself was no crime, but over the following weeks, similar accounts surfaced. A stable hand reported that the plantation's most aggressive horse, known for biting and kicking, allowed Isaiah to approach and place his hand against its forehead without resistance. A dairy worker claimed that restless cows calmed when the boy entered the barn. Chickens that scattered at every human footstep remained near him. Then came the dogs. The plantation kept several hunting dogs, trained, disciplined, responsive only to specific whistles. According to a written statement later preserved in county archives, the overseer once witnessed Isaiah step into the yard as the dogs were chained near the porch. Without any audible command, the animals ceased barking. Their posture changed, tails lowered. They fixed their gaze on the boy. The overseer called Isaiah's name sharply. No response. The boy appeared focused on the dogs. After several seconds, he turned away. The dogs resumed barking only after he disappeared behind the quarters. By mid-September, whispers had begun circulating beyond the plantation. Some called it a trick. Others called it unnatural. In 1857 South Carolina, superstition blended easily with fear. Enslaved communities carried spiritual traditions from West Africa, traditions misunderstood and often distorted by white landowners. Any unexplained behavior risked severe consequences. Yet the strangest incident had not yet occurred. On October 14, 1857, a child from a neighboring farm vanished near the woods that bordered both properties. Search parties combed the area through the night. Lanterns flickered between tree trunks. Men shouted into darkness. It was Isaiah who found the girl at dawn. He walked directly into a section of forest that searchers had already passed through twice. Witnesses claimed he did not hesitate or wander. He moved in a straight line, as if following a path invisible to others. The missing child was discovered seated beside a fallen log, unharmed but frightened. She claimed she had followed a deer and become lost. When asked how he knew where to look, Isaiah reportedly answered, "They told me." The statement reached the plantation owner by evening. Local authorities were summoned. There is no record of a formal charge, but Isaiah was confined and questioned repeatedly over the following days. Surviving fragments of testimony describe inconsistent answers. At times, he said the birds guided him. At others, he mentioned the dogs. Once, according to a deputy's notes, he claimed, "They speak when you listen." Interrogators attempted to reproduce the phenomena. Isaiah was brought before livestock under observation. Nothing occurred. The animals behaved normally. The boy remained silent. Then, on October 17, during a controlled test witnessed by 3 men and a visiting minister, Isaiah was placed alone inside the fenced cattle enclosure. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing happened. Observers began to dismiss the claims. And then the cattle shifted. One by one, they turned inward. A loose circle formed. No vocal command was heard. Isaiah's lips appeared to move, but the distance made it impossible to confirm sound. The animals stood still. The minister later wrote that he felt a heaviness in the air, though he could not define it. The test was halted abruptly. Isaiah was removed. It was after this demonstration that fear overcame curiosity. In an era already strained by political tension, the nation edging toward civil war, unexplained phenomena were interpreted as threats. Some believed the boy possessed occult knowledge. Others suspected manipulation, though none could explain how. It was at this point in the account that documentation becomes fragmented. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. Over the next week, Isaiah was reportedly isolated. No further public demonstrations were conducted. Several enslaved individuals later recounted that the boy seemed withdrawn but calm. One woman claimed he told her, "They are quiet now." On October 23, 1857, Isaiah disappeared. No signs of struggle were recorded. No official transfer documents exist. Plantation logs note only that the boy was no longer in residence. Speculation followed 3 primary theories. The first suggests he was quietly sold to another county to avoid attention. Records of slave sales from that month show several unnamed youths transferred, but none can be conclusively identified as Isaiah. The second theory, preserved in oral histories collected decades later, claims he was executed secretly out of fear. However, no burial site has ever been confirmed, and no financial record of such an action appears in surviving estate papers. The third theory, the one that endures, suggests he fled. Some former field hands later told interviewers that on the night of his disappearance, the plantation dogs did not bark. Not once. Despite unfamiliar movement reported near the tree line, it was as if the animals had chosen silence. There were no confirmed sightings of Isaiah beyond Edgefield County. Yet in the years following, scattered reports surfaced across rural Georgia and northern Florida of a quiet boy seen walking through woods accompanied by stray dogs or deer that did not flee. No official investigation was ever reopened. The Civil War began 3 years later, and many plantation records were destroyed. What remains are fragments, church notes, partial testimonies, and oral accounts passed through generations. Modern historians who have reviewed the case offer rational explanations. They suggest heightened animal sensitivity to calm behavior. They note that children raised around livestock can develop subtle nonverbal cues, posture, breath control, eye contact, that influence animal reactions. They argue that fear and superstition likely amplified ordinary events. Yet even among skeptics, one detail remains difficult to dismiss: the timing of the search for the lost girl. Multiple adult men had combed that exact stretch of forest. Isaiah walked directly to her location without deviation. Coincidence remains possible. So does instinct. In the absence of definitive records, the case of the boy who spoke to animals remains suspended between folklore and fact. There are no court documents, no preserved confessions, only a ledger entry, a vanished child, and testimony from witnesses who could not fully explain what they saw. October 1857, Edgefield County. A boy stands in a pasture, cattle form a circle, and somewhere in the distance dogs fall silent. What he understood, if anything at all, disappeared with him. In the months following Isaiah's disappearance, the official silence grew heavier than the rumors that replaced it. Plantation correspondence from November 1857 reveals an unusual increase in livestock losses across neighboring properties. Chickens found dead without signs of fox or hawk intrusion. 2 calves discovered beyond broken fencing, though no tracks suggested forced escape. A hunting party reported that deer behaved erratically in sections of forest previously considered reliable grounds. Individually, these incidents meant little. Rural farms frequently faced unexplained animal behavior, but taken together and placed against the recent memory of a boy who seemed to influence livestock without touch, they deepened unease. The plantation owner, whose personal letters survived in partial form, wrote to a relative in Charleston that order has returned, though disturbances among the animals persist in peculiar ways. He did not name Isaiah. He did not describe the earlier tests. The omission itself is notable. Within the enslaved quarters, oral accounts tell a different story. An elderly woman named Ruth, interviewed in the 1890s during a regional folklore survey, described Isaiah as a listener. She claimed he would sit near the woodline at dusk, eyes closed, as if concentrating on distant sound. When asked what he was doing, he reportedly answered, "They speak loud when the sun is low." Ruth insisted that Isaiah never framed his ability as power. He did not boast. He did not threaten. In her telling, he appeared confused by the alarm his behavior caused. He thought everyone heard them, she said decades later. He thought it was just the way the world was. This detail, though unverifiable, introduces a psychological dimension. Modern behavioral experts who have reviewed the fragments suggest that Isaiah may have possessed heightened sensory awareness. Children raised in outdoor environments often develop acute perception of animal cues, ear position, muscle tension, subtle shifts in movement that predict reaction. A calm posture can lower a herd's defensive state. A steady gaze can assert dominance over dogs accustomed to hierarchy. But this explanation does not account for the missing girl. The search records indicate that more than a dozen men combed the wooded boundary over a span of 6 hours. Lantern lights scanned the undergrowth. Names were shouted repeatedly. The child was found at dawn in a location described as not concealed, though overlooked. One possibility is simple oversight, fatigue, poor visibility. The girl may have shifted position during the night. Yet Isaiah's path remains curious. Thomas Reed, the same field hand who first witnessed the cattle circle, later described the search morning in detail. He claimed Isaiah did not join the group initially. Instead, he waited until others grew frustrated. Then he walked past them, entered the forest alone, and emerged with the child less than 15 minutes later. Reed insisted there was no hesitation in the boy's movement, like he had already been told, he reportedly said. Authorities at the time pressed Isaiah for specifics. The deputy's notes mention repeated questioning. Who told you? Who showed you? Did someone guide you? Isaiah's responses varied but shared one pattern. He never identified a person. They speak when you are quiet. They move before they are seen. They know the ground. Such phrases could reflect metaphor, a poetic child describing instinct, or they could reflect something less easily categorized, a worldview shaped by close observation of animal patterns. There is also a possibility, rarely mentioned in early accounts, assistance from enslaved adults. It is conceivable that someone else found the girl first and instructed Isaiah to retrieve her, either to protect the search party's pride or to reinforce an emerging myth. In a community where spiritual reputation could offer subtle protection, The appearance of special ability might discourage harsh treatment. However, no testimony supports this theory directly, and after Isaiah's disappearance, no individual claimed responsibility. The most unsettling development occurred in early December 1857. According to church attendance logs, several families declined Sunday service citing disturbance among stock. A brief margin note states, "Animals restless at night, no clear cause." A separate private letter from the minister describes hearing dogs howl in extended sequence across multiple properties on the same evening. Coordinated animal behavior is not uncommon. Weather shifts, predator movement, and mating cycles can trigger widespread response. But in the context of recent events, interpretation leaned towards superstition. Whispers began reframing Isaiah's absence not as removal, but as transformation. Stories spread that he had not been sold, that he had not been punished, that he had gone into the woods. In rural Southern folklore, forests often represented liminal space, neither fully civilized nor fully wild, a place where ordinary rules blurred. One former enslaved man, interviewed in 1901, claimed that for weeks after Isaiah vanished, livestock gathered near the tree line at dusk without instruction. He interpreted this as waiting. There is no physical evidence to support such accounts. No consistent pattern appears in agricultural records beyond that winter. By spring 1858, documented disturbances declined. Attention shifted toward escalating national conflict. The approach of the Civil War reshaped priorities. Economic strain, political rallies, and militia organization consumed local focus. If Isaiah had indeed been sold, his trail would have merged into the vast, often undocumented movement of enslaved individuals across state lines. If he fled, survival alone would have required extraordinary caution. A 12-year-old boy navigating dense forest and hostile patrols would face severe odds. Yet one final account complicates closure. In 1860, a small notice appeared in a Savannah newspaper describing a colored youth of quiet demeanor, observed in rural Georgia walking unaccompanied near a hunting lodge. The article mentioned that the lodge's dogs did not react aggressively, despite being known for territorial behavior. The youth reportedly declined conversation and continued northward. No name was provided, no follow-up investigation occurred. Some historians dismiss this as coincidence. Thousands of individuals matched such a description during that era, but the pattern, calm animals, silent dogs, solitary movement, echoes earlier testimony. Psychologists examining the case through a modern lens suggest a combination of factors: high emotional regulation, advanced environmental literacy, and perhaps an early understanding of animal conditioning principles not formally documented until decades later. It is possible Isaiah possessed no supernatural ability at all, only patience, only observation, only an unusual alignment between temperament and environment. And yet the social reaction remains telling. Fear escalated not because of harm committed, but because of behavior that defied expectation. In a rigid hierarchy built on control, the idea that a child might influence forces outside that structure, even livestock, disrupted assumptions. The ultimate absence of resolution sustains the mystery. No grave marker bears his name. No emancipation record confirms his adulthood. No family account traces his lineage beyond 1857. What remains are layered testimonies filtered through time, some practical, some embellished, all incomplete. Edgefield County today holds no official plaque acknowledging the case. The pasture where the cattle formed their circle has long since changed ownership, fences replaced, roads paved, forest lines reduced. But archival ink endures. The boy again found speaking in the pasture, livestock unsettled. A quiet observation, recorded without commentary, preserved without conclusion. Whether Isaiah possessed rare insight into animal behavior, or whether fear transformed ordinary events into legend, may never be fully determined. What is certain is this: in October 1857, a child stood among cattle that did not move away. He located a missing girl where grown men had failed, and days later, he vanished into a landscape already heavy with tension and suspicion. No trial followed, no confession surfaced, no body was found. Only silence. And sometimes, silence is the most enduring evidence of all. Years passed. The war came. Plantations fractured. Records burned. Men who once insisted on order found themselves drafted into chaos. In that upheaval, the memory of a quiet boy in a pasture should have disappeared entirely. But it did not. In 1866, during the early Reconstruction period, a traveling agent for the Freedmen's Bureau recorded a brief, unusual exchange while documenting labor contracts in rural Georgia. Among standard entries about wages and acreage, a margin note appears in different handwriting. Inquiry made concerning youth reputed to calm dogs. Locals evasive. No name followed. No elaboration. The agent's journal, preserved in partial form, offers context. He wrote of communities unsettled by war, of former plantations reorganizing under fragile agreements. He mentioned tensions between freed families and former owners. And then, in a single paragraph, he described a conversation with an elderly freedman who insisted that some children are born knowing the speech of beasts. The agent dismissed the statement as folklore. Yet the repetition of the theme across counties suggests continuity of narrative. By the 1870s, small clusters of oral stories had begun to circulate in rural black communities across parts of South Carolina and Georgia. They described a young boy who could quiet the hounds. In some versions, he led others safely through woods patrolled by search parties. In others, he warned of approaching riders before dust appeared on the road. These accounts vary in detail and likely evolved over time. Memory reshapes itself around need. During Reconstruction, when violence and intimidation were common, a figure who could silence tracking dogs would have symbolized protection. Historians caution against conflating folklore with documented fact. There is no written proof linking these later legends directly to Isaiah of Edgefield County. The timeline is plausible but unverified. Still, certain consistencies remain. First, the absence of aggression. Nowhere in preserved accounts is the boy described as commanding animals to attack. The emphasis is always on calm, on stillness, on restraint. Second, the animal's response appears collective rather than singular. Not one trained dog but groups, not one horse but herds. Third, the boy himself rarely speaks in these retellings. When he does, his words are minimal. From a behavioral science perspective, group animal response can be influenced by subtle cues invisible to casual observers. Dogs, in particular, read micro-expressions and muscle tension. A human who does not project fear may disrupt expected prey-chase patterns. Livestock, sensitive to posture and eye contact, often mirror calm energy. Yet such explanations rely on controlled observation. In Isaiah's case, controlled tests were brief and poorly documented. The October 17 enclosure experiment remains the only structured attempt recorded, and even that account is filtered through witness memory. There is another dimension rarely explored: trauma. Children raised under constant threat sometimes develop heightened environmental awareness. The ability to detect slight shifts in sound or movement can become survival adaptation. Isaiah may have sensed the lost girl through auditory cues, distant crying, rustling, that exhausted searchers overlooked. As for the cattle forming a circle, herd animals naturally respond to perceived central focus. If Isaiah stood quietly and held their gaze without abrupt motion, their formation could reflect curiosity rather than obedience. These interpretations ground the case in plausibility. But plausibility does not erase unanswered questions. In 1883, a retired minister from Edgefield County wrote a letter to his son, reflecting on events of his youth. The letter, archived in a private collection, contains a passage many researchers consider the most direct acknowledgement of lingering doubt. He wrote, "There was a boy once who unsettled our sense of order. I witnessed the cattle arrangement with my own eyes. I do not claim sorcery, nor do I claim understanding, only that something passed between creature and child that did not pass through us." The phrasing is restrained, no supernatural claim, only admission of limitation. By the late 19th century, the story had thinned into rural anecdote. Children were warned not to wander into woods, lest the listening boy find you first. In other communities, he became a quiet guardian figure. No verified adult matching Isaiah's description appears in census records with traceable origin from Edgefield in 1857. That absence could indicate death, name change, migration, or simple loss of documentation, common in post-war Reconstruction. A modern archival review conducted in the early 2000s attempted cross-referencing sale logs, runaway notices, and military labor rosters. None definitively matched. One runaway advertisement from early 1858 describes a slender colored boy near 13, speaks softly, avoids eye contact. It offers a reward, but distinguishing traits are minimal, no mention of animals. If Isaiah was sold, he may have lived anonymously elsewhere, his earlier experiences suppressed or forgotten. If he fled and survived in forested terrain, he may have relied on the very observational skills that unsettled his former captors. There remains a quieter, more unsettling possibility that the myth outlived the person by design. In oppressed communities, stories sometimes serve protective functions. A belief that certain individuals possess unusual harmony with the natural world can discourage pursuit, instill caution, or build cohesion. Isaiah's narrative may have evolved into a symbol, not because of confirmed ability, but because of collective need. Yet symbols rarely emerge from nothing. The original ledger entry predates the legend. It documents a specific observation before any broader folklore formed. That entry anchors the case in recorded time, October 17, 1857. A boy in a pasture, livestock unsettled. That is where certainty ends. No surviving evidence confirms supernatural communication. None conclusively disproves extraordinary sensitivity. The available facts remain narrow. He was observed interacting unusually with animals. He located a missing child with unexpected efficiency. He was questioned. He disappeared. Everything beyond that rests on testimony, inference, and the fragile architecture of memory. Edgefield County's landscape has changed, but behavioral patterns in animals have not. Modern trainers demonstrate that calm, deliberate human presence can alter herd dynamics. Wildlife biologists confirm that certain individuals display remarkable intuitive rapport with animals without formal training. If Isaiah possessed such rapport, it would not have been magic. It would have been rare alignment, temperament meeting environment under conditions few understood. Still, there is an image that endures in the quiet corners of the archive. A thin boy standing motionless as cattle shift into formation. Dogs lowering their voices without command. Searchers moving blindly through forest while he walks straight ahead. No grand revelation follows. No dramatic confession surfaces. Only the persistent absence of explanation. In the end, the case remains what it began as. A brief disturbance recorded in ink, carried forward by those who could not fully interpret what they saw. And somewhere between instinct and legend, between documented fact and inherited story, the figure of the listening boy remains suspended. Unconfirmed, unclosed, unforgotten. The time the 20th century began, the original witnesses were gone. What remained were layered retellings, softened by time but stubborn in their core details. Researchers who later attempted to reconstruct the case found themselves working not from official files, but from fragments, family letters, margin notes, oral recollections recorded decades after the fact. In 1904, a regional folklorist documenting post-slavery narratives in the Carolinas recorded a story from a man who identified himself only as Caleb. He claimed to have been a child on a neighboring property in 1857. According to Caleb, the boy from Edgefield did not command animals in the way rumors later suggested. Instead, Caleb described long periods of stillness. He would wait, Caleb reportedly said, longer than any of us could stand, and the waiting changed things. This detail introduces an overlooked element, time. Most adults in the documented accounts approached animals with expectation, of control, of labor, of response. A child willing to remain motionless for extended stretches might disrupt that dynamic. Herd animals read impatience. Dogs detect agitation. A human presence stripped of urgency could produce unusual reactions. Yet the patience described by Caleb bordered on ritual. He claimed Isaiah would sit in the pasture until dusk, ignoring insects, heat, and the calls of others. Only when the light began to fade would movement occur among the animals. From a physiological standpoint, dusk is a transitional period for livestock. Feeding patterns shift. Vigilance increases. Sound carries differently in cooling air. An individual attuned to these subtle changes might appear predictive rather than reactive. Still, the lost girl remains the fulcrum of the mystery. In 1912, a schoolteacher compiling local history interviewed descendants of the missing child. Family memory maintained that she insisted, until her death in adulthood, that a bird showed him the way. The phrase is ambiguous. It could reflect childhood imagination, or it could be a simplified description of following bird calls disturbed by human presence. Forest ecology offers a practical possibility. When a human moves through underbrush, birds often react vocally. An experienced listener might triangulate unusual clusters of alarm calls. Searchers unfamiliar with such cues could overlook them. If Isaiah had grown accustomed to observing animal reactions to danger, dogs alerting to strangers, cattle shifting at predators, he may have applied similar pattern recognition in the woods. None of these interpretations diminish the social consequences he faced. In 1857, deviation from expected behavior in enslaved children carried risk. Perceived difference could be framed as threat. The more controlled demonstration in the cattle enclosure suggests that curiosity had already turned to scrutiny. Once fear entered the equation, protection would have been limited. The most comprehensive modern review of the case was undertaken in the late 1990s by a regional historian specializing in Reconstruction-era archives. She focused not on folklore but on transactional records, slave sales, labor contracts, property inventories. Her findings were inconclusive, but revealing in their gaps. A ledger from November 1857 lists a male youth transferred from Edgefield to a broker operating near Savannah. The description is sparse. Approximate age 12 to 14, slight build. No name recorded. The broker's subsequent sales logs were destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1864. This youth was Isaiah. His relocation may explain both his disappearance and the later Georgia sightings. It would also align with the plantation owner's apparent desire to quiet attention without formal proceedings. Yet no definitive link exists. Another thread emerged from military labor rosters during the Civil War. Enslaved boys were sometimes impressed into support roles, digging trenches, tending animals for cavalry units. A roster from 1862 references a quiet colored boy skilled with horses, assigned temporarily to a supply detachment near Augusta. Again, no name. If Isaiah possessed unusual calm around animals, military units reliant on horses might have valued that trait. However, without corroborating details, this remains speculation. What complicates the narrative further is the consistent absence of harm. Across all accounts, documented and oral, there is no record of Isaiah using animals to intimidate or injure. The fear attributed to him seems projected rather than experienced directly. That projection reflects broader cultural anxieties of the time. Mid-19th century Southern society operated on rigid hierarchies reinforced by perceived natural order. Animals were property. Enslaved individuals were property. Control flowed downward. The idea that an enslaved child might influence livestock without instruction inverted that structure subtly but powerfully. Even if the phenomenon was ordinary in mechanism, it was extraordinary in implication. In reviewing the October 17 enclosure test, modern analysts note the observer's distance. They could not hear clearly. They interpreted lip movement as speech. But cattle often orient collectively toward a focal stimulus, sound, scent, or simply novelty. A silent boy placed alone among them might have become that stimulus. The circular formation, though dramatic in description, may reflect natural herd spacing rather than ritual arrangement. But the emotional memory of witnesses suggests something deeper unsettled them. The minister's private letter, written years later, did not accuse the boy of wrongdoing. It confessed discomfort at not understanding. Discomfort can shape memory as strongly as fact. As decades passed, Isaiah's story thinned into cautionary tale, then into protective myth, then into obscurity. By the 1930s, Works Progress Administration interviews captured only faint echoes. One elderly woman recalled a child who could hush dogs, but she placed the event sometime before the war without specific date. The erosion of detail over time is expected, yet the persistence of core elements, stillness, animals, silence, suggests a shared origin. In the absence of definitive closure, three primary interpretations remain viable. The first is environmental literacy, a child exceptionally skilled at reading animal behavior, misinterpreted by observers unaccustomed to such subtlety. The second is narrative amplification, a small series of unusual but natural events magnified by fear and retelling into something extraordinary. The third is protective mythmaking, a community elevating a vulnerable child's difference into symbolic strength. None require supernatural explanation. None fully erase the unease described by original witnesses. What remains most striking is the boy's own reported demeanor. He did not defend himself with elaborate claims. He did not attempt to demonstrate repeatedly. He did not seek attention. When questioned, his answers were brief and abstract. They speak when you listen. From a modern cognitive perspective, that statement aligns with attunement rather than magic. Many animal trainers describe communication not as language but as attention, mutual awareness without words. Perhaps Isaiah possessed that awareness intuitively. Or perhaps we are reconstructing competence from fragments because the alternative, a mystery without mechanism, feels incomplete. The pasture in Edgefield no longer resembles its 1857 form. The woods where the girl was found have narrowed. Generations have passed without new evidence surfacing. Yet the case resists final categorization. A documented observation, a successful search, a disappearance without trace. In investigative terms, it remains unsolved not because of complexity, but because of absence. No body, no confirmed relocation, no confession of fabrication. Only testimony that something occurred beyond expectation. And sometimes, in historical cases, absence is not emptiness. It is a boundary where records end and interpretation begins. The boy who stood among cattle in October 1857 left no monument, no signature, no preserved likeness. But the quiet disruption he caused endured long enough to enter ink, then memory, then legend. Whether he was simply a child with unusual patience, or something his contemporaries could not categorize, his story remains fixed at that intersection of observation and uncertainty. A child in a pasture, animals drawing near, men watching from a distance. And then nothing more. By the mid-20th century, the paper trail had ended completely. No new archival discoveries surfaced. No confirmed descendant stepped forward with letters or heirlooms. The name Isaiah itself remained unverified, drawn from oral recollection rather than a birth record. In official terms, the boy from Edgefield County dissolved into statistical anonymity, one of thousands of enslaved children whose lives were documented only when they disrupted expectation. And yet the disruption endured. When modern historians revisit October 1857, they approach it cautiously. They do not look for the supernatural. They look for pattern. They examine agricultural practices, herd behavior, social hierarchy, and the psychology of fear. They reconstruct landscape conditions, tree density, pasture size, livestock breeds common to the region. They test whether cattle naturally form inward-facing clusters when uncertain. They analyze whether tracking dogs can be quieted by posture alone. Most conclude that nothing in the record violates natural law. Animals respond to calm presence. Birds reveal disturbance in forest canopies. Herds mirror subtle signals. A perceptive child could have understood these patterns without formal instruction. But explanation does not fully replace impact. The overseer's reaction, the minister's unease, the deputy's repeated questioning. These responses reveal more about the observers than the boy himself. In a society rigidly structured around control, the suggestion that influence could exist outside that structure was destabilizing, not because it was magical, but because it was independent. The final confirmed entry remains that church ledger line dated October 17, 1857. It does not accuse. It does not interpret. It records observation without conclusion. The boy again found speaking in the pasture, livestock unsettled. Days later he was gone. If he was sold, his life continued elsewhere under another name, his early experiences absorbed into survival. If he fled, the forests that once served as backdrop may have become refuge. If he died, no marker preserves the location. And if the later stories of a quiet youth walking safely past watchful dogs hold even partial truth, then perhaps his skill, whatever its source, served him beyond that single autumn. In the end, the case does not close with revelation. It closes with proportion. A rural county, a tense pre-war year, a child who behaved differently. History often amplifies the extraordinary and erases the vulnerable. In this instance, it did both. It magnified his difference into rumor, then allowed his physical existence to vanish into gaps left by war and neglect. What remains is not proof of the supernatural, nor is it proof of deception. It is a documented moment when several adults witness something they could not immediately explain, and chose fear over curiosity. The pasture has long since changed. The trees have thinned. The cattle that once formed a silent circle returned to ordinary grazing before winter came. But the question lingers in the quiet margins of the archive. Was Isaiah simply a boy who listened more closely than others? Or did the world, in that brief October light, reveal to him a language most people never pause long enough to hear? There are no further entries, no final testimony. Only the still image of a child standing calmly as animals draw near. And then, as so often happens in forgotten cases, silence